a lot of unpredictability, new players, new behavior. And by the way, I'm talking about the Delhi test between India and Australia. This applies to some degree to the world scenario as well. And if we put together really the cumulative impact of 3 years of COVID, the damage that it has done to the global socio-economic fabric, the year of the Ukraine conflict, the knock-on effects, the fuel, food, fertilizer, trade disruptions, the shortages it has created, the uncertainties it has enhanced. And then take some of the perennial challenges which pre-existed. Climate. Now, climate was a growing concern. I think in the last few years, what we thought the future portended has actually happened to us. So we are witnessing climate events on an increasingly larger, more catastrophic scale. And in fact, today in any global risk assessment, I would say building in a climate calculation is very much a part of that. And there are the other concerns about terrorism, concerns about maritime security. There are also growing concerns about financial sustainability. I think there are more than 70 countries who have or are engaging the IMF in terms of stabilizing their national finances. And unlike in the near past, many of these are not low-income countries. Some of them are middle-income countries. So I think even an optimistic view of the world would be reasonably pessimistic at this point of time. My second point, flowing from that, if there is today really an urgent collective task, it is how to de-risk the global economy. And part of that is, exactly the events that I have referred to, over-dependence on manufacturing, over-dependence on energy, over-dependence on services. So how do we create more reliable and resilient supply chains? In a more digital world, how do we ensure at least the minimal trust and transparency? Because the fact is that we cannot be agnostic about data in the manner in which we were mistakenly agnostic about products. Where my data resides, who processes it, what do they do with it, how do they extrapolate it, matters deeply to me. So for us to pretend that all nations are the same, and it's none of our business what happens inside, I think that era is now behind us, and we must not just accept it, we must actually be aware of it and make plans to deal with this. And in fact, Minister Bhavan and I were just discussing, this applies as well to green technologies. We should not end up in a world where our desire to be greener leads us to be more dependent on a few and therefore more insecure. So how do we decentralize? How do we collaborate? How do we diversify? In a sense, how do we democratize the world? Democratize it technologically, democratize it economically. I think this is, I would say, the second point which I would flag for your attention. Now, if I were to pick 3 words to put before you the state of our contemporary world, those 3 words for me would be, number 1, globalization. Because globalization has worked, it's had its problems, it's had its downsides. but it's had actually an enormous impact, both the pluses and minuses, on global society. Globalization actually has helped to create a rebalancing. You spoke, Justin, about our G20 presidency. G20 itself is proof of that rebalancing, that till 2008, the global leadership such as it was seen as G7. And the fact was that the events of 2008-2009 demonstrated that G7 was too narrow. So I use G20, but I would not stop at G20. I use that as a metaphor to underline the point that if you look today at the production and consumption centers of the world, they are vastly different, certainly from what they were in 1945, but I would say almost every decade it's very useful to actually see a decadal chart of who's up and who's down and how the balances are shifting there. And flowing from that rebalancing today is, and I use the word present continuous here, is actually creating an emerging multipolarity. That there will still, I mean, the United States, to my mind, has been the premier power in the foreseeable future. I still see it as the premier power. And clearly the rise of China, the share of China in global economy, in global technology, in global influence, these are undeniable factors. But the fact is that in the, let us say, let's take this decade, you're clearly going to see many more powers who will have more influence on global debates and global outcomes than they did before. And to my mind, certainly some of them would be sufficiently separated from the rest of the herd to be seen as a pole, and therefore you will have multipolarity. Since Brexit, there's obviously been a very intense global debate about globalization. And President Trump's election sort of intensified that debate, if I can put it that way. But to my mind, you know, it's not an issue of is globalization good or bad. You can't turn it back. It's therefore real. It's hardwired into our existence. The issue is really what's the right model of globalization. That is it a model which is fairer, which is fairer within societies, fairer between societies? Is it a model where the benefits exceed the vulnerabilities? Because that is today also a very important downside of globalization. So I think that's, to my mind, actually a key global debate. So one is de-risking the global economy, but the second really is the model, the preferred direction of globalization that a lot of countries want to see. Now, in a changing world, obviously there will be new conversations. And among the conversations we are seeing is are those of the importance of values, of beliefs, of ideologies, not just in a very antiseptic way of interests. And there is a whole debate which flows out of that, you know. One debate, of course, is that of democratic countries, pluralistic societies, and those who are not. But there's another debate, and it's a debate within the democratic world, which is really whose democracy, whose values, whose definition, whose norms. Because here too, the transformation of the world, the rebalancing, a lot of it derives from an era of, I would say, a G7 dominance, a very Euro-Atlantic view of what is democracy. Now, the fact, if I can put it somewhat immodestly, the fact that democracy is perceived as a global aspiration is actually because India chose to be a democracy at the time of its independence. And because the first country which was decolonizing, and it happened to be the largest country which was decolonizing, chose a difficult democratic path, and then, despite decades of adversity and limited resources, stuck to that path. And stuck to that path when actually other democracies questioned the viability of that path. That today is very much, I think, at the center of a debate and a conversation that we must have on democracy. That there are practices and beliefs and cultures which are relevant to how democracy is actually executed and improved. My next point, of course, is the welfare of the world. And here again, the fact that the capacities of some countries are not what they used to be is a very relevant factor. I particularly refer here to the United States. For me, the big change in the last decade is not that the US capacities are relatively less than what they used to be. It is that the US is actually getting into a mindset where it's aware of that limitation and is open to working with like-minded partners to address it. And like-minded partners include countries who are not treaty allies. Now, in Australia, it's not a change you will readily realize because you are a treaty ally. For you, working with the United States is not anything new. It's part of your history for the last 80 years. For us, it is. So, and it's, you know, certainly I would emphasize that there have been big changes in our foreign policy, but I would equally stress that there's been a big change in American thinking, that this is not the same United States with which we dealt with in the 60s or 80s or even, frankly, in 2005. That there is an evolution out there, and that evolution today you can see on a whole range of issues. And as a result, we actually today have new strategic concepts, new geopolitical theaters, if you would, new mechanisms, and obviously the most notable of these in terms of on a conceptual level is the Indo-Pacific, at a mechanism level is the Quad. And the Quad to me is a very, very, it's an enterprise laden with a lot of significance, because if you look at it, there's that Indo-Pacific space, 4 countries, not geographically contiguous at all, with an enormous amount of sea space and some land space between them, but who have in different ways overcome their own past outlook to forge something common in response to a perceived global and regional need. And it's an endeavor with which I happen perhaps to be associated more closely than most others. I'm still probably the only witness in office of the first effort in 2007. And I've seen it at various levels, from doing it as a permanent secretary to a foreign minister, and now we're seeing it as a summit level, and Australia will be hosting the summit soon.